So we had now this character of Peter Grant who was way ahead of his time and revolutionary in terms of his management style and what he thought was right to protect the artist. He was a guy who was absolutely going to protect his artist. He was not a guy who was going to rip off his artist ever. He was one of the few people who was so against the idea of ripping off my own artist, which most managers are not above doing that at all. So he was ultimately trustworthy, the ultimate foot soldier for that band. And so this is where they start to team up and figure out how they're going to create Jimmy's new band after the Yardbirds. And the plan was after they would find the right musicians, and then the idea was Jimmy would would produce the album himself. And rather than go to a record company and say, "Hey, I'm Jimmy Page of the Yardbirds. Can I get a record deal?" They did it the other way around. They said, Jimmy said, "I have enough money to finance this album on my own because I've made all this money during my session days."
Yeah, he was like a millionaire when he started Led Zeppelin, from what I understood.
Yeah, that's what I read too. I mean, millionaire seems unrealistic, really. He may have been like comparatively a millionaire. Maybe he did. I don't know. But he had enough money to go into a studio and spend, something like £2,000, which was a lot of money in 1968.
Yeah.
If you looked at that in today's dollars, it would be a lot of money. But to produce an album on his own dime. So he went in, we're jumping ahead again, but the idea was to make the album first and then shop it to the record companies and get the best deal they could get, which was sort of, revolutionary. Again, this wasn't the way it was done. The way it was done was you had a band and somebody signed you to a label and then you made your album. Jimmy wanted to do it the way that he could control everything.
£2,000 back then would be like 50,000 today. Yeah,
so you think about that. And think about, he may have not had £1 million in the bank, 1 million or something like that, but he had enough that he was certainly well off and could do that out of his own pocket and gamble on his own creativity and his own vision. And here's where, this is the thing that is one of the things we're going to talk about, is this vision that Jimmy Page had to create a band that was sort of building off of what was starting with Cream and the loud bands and the guys who were playing loud through Marshalls. This is before Sabbath. This is before Deep Purple was really hard rock. It was around the same time Deep Purple were getting together, but they were much more of a psychedelic rock band in that time frame. So anyway, Jimmy Page starts looking for musicians, and I can't remember who came first, but I think John Paul Jones, who had known him from the session days. John Paul Jones was also a session player, a genius musician in his own right, who could play just about any instrument you handed him. Wonderful song arranger. He was doing a lot of arrangement work for other artists. He was working with Donovan in that era, and Jimmy Page was playing on the Donovan sessions, so they got to know each other that way. And John Paul Jones was looking to do something, and his wife said, "Oh, isn't this your friend Jimmy? He's looking for a bass player. You should call him." And so John Paul Jones called up Jimmy Page and said, "Hey, I hear you're looking to put a new band together. I would like to put myself out there as a bass player if you're interested." And Jimmy was smart enough to realize this guy could add a ton to the whole sound of the band, whether he was playing keys, whether he was playing acoustic instruments. He was just a marvelous musician and the ultimate utility guy that you want in your band. And so I think he came first. And then the idea was he wanted Steve Marriott as the singer at one point. Steve Marriott had been in the Small Faces, and then he was in Humble Pie, and he had this bluesy whiskey voice kind of thing. And Steve Marriott was under Don Arden's, you come back to this, Don Arden's management, I think, at that time. And when Jimmy Page and Peter Grant came sniffing around to see if he was available, Don Harden said something to the effect, "You're going to have a hard time playing guitar with broken hands."
Yeah.
Yeah. This is Sharon Osbourne's father, by the way.
Oh, really?
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Yeah. He was a gangster. He was a total gangster. He would hang people out windows and stuff and threaten them. And so basically they were told in no uncertain terms, stop sniffing around Steve Marriott. You can't have him. And if you try to get him, bad things are going to happen to you. And Peter Grant was not yet at his level of stature he had been working for Don. And Don taught him a lot about the business. So he was not going to go up against Don Arden and pirate one of his artists, right? So that didn't happen. And then they talked to this guy named Terry Reid, who's another really good singer on the scene at that time. And Terry Reid, at that moment in time, gets asked to join Jimmy Page's band. And he knew Jimmy from the Yardbirds, and he turned down the gig. He had his own solo career going, and he didn't, this is the guy who turned down being the singer in Led Zeppelin. So imagine, if he hadn't turned it down, how different history would have been. This is one of those moments where we talk about what would have been if Tony Iommi had stayed in Jethro Tull, right?
Well, what would have been a good example of his singing? So we can maybe imagine him on Black Dog or something.
Yeah, I think, you can't imagine him on any track specifically, but I mean, you could look up. I mean, you can find Terry Reid in YouTube and see what he sounds like and stuff. I think he had a bluesy voice, a strong voice, a good voice. He didn't have Robert Plant's voice, but what he did say to Jimmy Page was, "I can't do this, but there's a guy up north named Robert Plant. You should check him out." So word of mouth, right? Robert Plant had been signed to CBS Records, and he had done like 2 pop singles that had done absolutely nothing. And he was just up there playing in a local band with a drummer named John Bonham, on and off. That those two had known each other for years, and they'd been in and out of the different bands together. And the thing with Bonham was every time there was a better gig, Bonham would leave whatever band he was in and go for the better gig. So at one time he'd be in the band and one time he wouldn't be in the band. But they knew each other very well. They were friends from the time they were. I mean, this is now Jimmy's 25, Robert Plant's maybe 19 or 20, and Bonham is also 19 or 20. And so Peter Grant and Jimmy Page, they get in a car and they go up to the Midlands. I think it was Birmingham. And they see Robert Plant in this band. And Jimmy's like, yeah, this is the guy. Let me see if we can, if we vibe with him or anything like that. They basically went back down to London and they contacted Robert Plant, and they had a hard time reaching him for a while because for whatever reason, but they finally sent him a telegram or something, are you interested in being in Jimmy Page's, trying out for this band or whatever it was. Jimmy Page invites Robert Plant down to Pangbourne, his houseboat, and they spend like a week together just vibing off of each other, getting to know each other, playing things that excite them, talking about what the music could be like and everything, and seeing how they connected on a personal level and a musical level. And they start doing a little bit of, Jimmy Page is like, I have this idea to do this Joan Baez cover called Babe, I'm Going to Leave You, but we're going to do it like this and do it explosive and percussive on an acoustic and everything. And they were starting to formulate their relationship. And there was a time Jimmy Page was hoping he might get Keith Moon out of The Who to be on drums. And that came out of that session, the Beck's Bolero session, where it was Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, Keith Moon, and I believe it was Nicky Hopkins on piano. And that was sort of like a superstar session. It was a Jeff Beck track, and Jimmy produced it.
Yeah, that's an interesting one to listen to.
It's a great track.
There's just so much going on there. The people in that room, to get that crew together in one room to play a song, that's really something. Right.
And the story goes, that scream before the thing kicks into a different tempo, it goes through the bolero progression, which is the Ravel bolero progression, kind of. It certainly nods to that. And then it becomes this rock jam. There's a scream that happens right before they go into the rock jam, and that's Keith Moon screaming, and I think he hit $10,000 mic with a drumstick and broke it. And they tore into this track, and then I guess at the end they all went out to the pub and had a few drinks, and they talked about the possibility of putting this band together with that kind of lineup. And I believe it was John Entwistle who said it would go over like a lead balloon. And then someone said like a Led Zeppelin. And Jimmy liked that. Jimmy liked that name. And one of the things that was part of Jimmy's vision, and we've talked about this a little already, is that he wanted to have the heaviness, the amped up bluesy sound of Cream, but he also wanted to have the lightness, the acoustic stuff, and he wanted to indulge in his love of folk music and Celtic music, and I guess you would call it Middle Eastern music as well, and explore more than just electric blues, right? Because electric blues was the thing of that day, of that time. Most people were doing that kind of rock. If they were doing heavy rock, it was blues based. Page wanted to do more than that. So he wanted this thing that was sort of like, he called it heavy and light and shade. And, you know, a Led Zeppelin is a good metaphor for something that's both light and heavy. And so that name stuck with him. And he chose to use it, obviously. And then Robert Plant had eventually said, no, you need to go see John Bonham, my friend John Bonham. He's the guy we want on drums. And they all trucked back on up to the Midlands, and Jimmy saw John Bonham play and was just absolutely blown away, and rightfully so. But I mean, John Bonham was a fully formed beast of a musician by the time he was 18. He was a man. He was not a kid, like, you know, in on the drums anyway. He was that powerhouse even then, and he was the guy who was constantly getting kicked out of bands for playing too loud in the band. And it's just the way he was built, and that, you know, and Jimmy Page saw that, and, you know, you look at that and you go, yeah, I'm going to drop this Ferrari engine into my band, and, you know, it'll make everything better. And the truth of the matter is, you're only as good. Any band is only as good as its drummer. I mean, the older I get, the truer that seems to become. And whatever drummer you're talking about, you know, your band is only as good as your drummer is. And if you have a drummer who's like putting a jet engine in your band, it raises everything. It raises everybody else's playing. It inspires you to play better. It inspires you to play in different ways than you might, because they'll come up with something that's different, and you will play off of that.
Yeah,
and
I can personally attest to that too. I remember when I lived in Florida for a while, there was this jam session I would go to, and there was one drummer called Chris Ozuna. I'm sure he's still around there. And whenever he would join the jam, it would just like, it would change everything, you know?
Yeah. It's really, if you're not a musician, you can't even imagine the difference it is. I can tell you from a personal experience of mine, when I came back to New York and I started working at a specific company that I am at now, they had a company band, and I played in this company band for like one season, and it became too much of a pain in the butt to keep doing it. But the drummer was terrible, and it really held us back. And because you can't, you know, it's like you have to have, if you have a company band, everybody in the band has to work at the company. And so you have to find a drummer within that company. Right. And the drummer in that company was a guy who had switched from guitar to drums. He was terrible. And it really held us back. And it really did limit what we could do, and it limited how well we could do it. Now I'm in a project now where I'm making an album with a guy who is a pro. He's an absolute monster. He's a killer drummer. And I send him demos with like, here's a demo of the song with the drum machine track, just to give you an idea of what it's supposed to sound like, right? And he'll send me back the drum track with, you know, he'll replace the drum machine with his drums. And when they come back, they sound so great that when I go in to then do real guitars, I'm playing off of what he does. And that's telling me to do different things that I never thought of. I can do this. I can syncopate with him. It basically inspires you to have somebody who can play that way if you're a guitar player. And I don't know about every guitar player, but I know personally, I'm a person who has come up with some of my best stuff jamming with drummers, come up with some of my best riffs. If I have to sit there and come up with a guitar riff with just in an empty room with me and a guitar, I can do it, and I have done it, and I've written songs that way. But when I can bounce ideas off of a drummer who's good, I come up with better stuff. It just seems to spark my creativity in a way. And for a guy like Jimmy Page, whether it was Zeppelin or anything he's done post-Zeppelin, Jimmy Page is a guy who is super attuned to playing with the drummer and playing off what the drummer does. And having Bonham is your ultimate guy for that.
I think the Ferrari engine thing is a good analogy, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like my company band had a Yugo engine or like, a lawnmower engine, right? And when you start playing with a guy who's a monster, it really does up your game because you start playing to their level and you start realizing I can do this now because he can go with me. I can do that now because he can go with me, or he can give me a beat. How many times did the song come up because the drummer started playing a beat and then you go, oh, let me play off of that. That becomes huge in most bands. So now you have the four members of Led Zeppelin and Peter Grant. They coalesce. They get together in a room. They talked about this many times. The first time they got together in a really tiny room to play together, they said it was magic. The room just exploded with sound. They played Train Kept A-Rollin', the old Yardbirds song. And everybody, by the time they had finished playing that one song, everybody knew in that room that we have something here. We have some chemistry here. We have some magic here. This is the band. This is going to be it. And Robert Plant at that time was an incredible vocalist at that young age because his voice wasn't really beat up at that time. It would be later. He would have harder and harder time over the years. But, I mean, he was a phenom at that time, as was Page, as was Bonham. And, in his own way, so was John Paul Jones. So that's when they go into the studio to do the first album on Jimmy Page's dime. I believe they recorded it in 36 hours or something like that. A very short amount of time. They went in there, they were rehearsed, they made the most of their time in the studio. There wasn't a lot of messing about. They went in, they got it done quickly, and when they were done, they had the master tapes. It was produced by Jimmy Page himself, with Eddie Kramer, I believe, was the engineer. And Eddie Kramer of Jimi Hendrix fame and all these other things that he ever produced. Eddie Kramer was the engineer of the early Zeppelin albums, and he wanted a production credit, but Jimmy was like, no, you're not producing this. I'm producing this. You're an engineer on this. I know what I want. I know how to get it. And Eddie Kramer, as a renowned producer as he is known to be now, he claims he learned stuff from Jimmy Page, and that Jimmy Page learned stuff from him. And I don't have any trouble believing that.
Can you explain the difference between a producer and an engineer?
The easiest way to explain that quickly is that the producer is the guy with the vision of it should sound like this. And the engineer might be the guy who knows how to technically get that.
Okay.
All right. How to twiddle the knobs and do all the things to get that. Jimmy would say, I want to put the microphones here. I want to get this sound. I want to do this. And one guy's the brain, the other guy's the hands. Think of it that way.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, that's an overly simplistic view. All right. There's a lot of, if you talk about, for example, how much of Van Halen's sound was Don Landy, the engineer, rather than Ted Templeman, the producer. Ted Templeman produced pretty much all of the Roth era Van Halen albums, and Don Landy was the engineer. And Ted Templeman gives most of the credit to the Van Halen sound to Don. And, Don Landy still worked with Eddie after Ted Templeman was not. So, I mean, there is, this is a very loose generalization, but think of the producer as the guy with the vision in his brain, and the engineer is the guy who helps him get it.
Okay.
So Eddie Kramer was the engineer on those sessions, and we'll listen to some of those tracks and we'll talk about some of what's noteworthy with some of those tracks. But the point of the matter was, again, now they've cut this album on Jimmy's dime. Jimmy owns the master tapes. The record company doesn't own them. No record company owns them. No record company was in there saying, you got to do this, you got to do that. Where's the single? Where's the single? Right? All of the things that record companies are notorious for doing. Because they did this album on their own, on spec, basically, they were banking on Jimmy's reputation, and it was a good bet because people did know who Jimmy was. They did know he was a hot guitarist. They did know he was a hot session guy. The guys in America, Clive Davis of CBS, Ahmet Ertegun of Atlantic, they knew who Jimmy Page was, and they knew how good he was, and they knew he was coming up with something. So they take their master tapes, Peter Grant, Jimmy Page, they fly to New York and they meet with Atlantic and they meet with CBS, and they met with CBS to sort of like play one against the other. They knew they wanted to be on Atlantic. For whatever reason at that time, it turned out to be the right move, but they knew they wanted to be on Atlantic, but they met with CBS just so that they could go into Atlantic and say, well, CBS is interested in this too, so they could get a better deal. And this is the beginning of their pretty much their mercenary dealings with labels, and with later on it would be with promoters and with venues and stuff, and how they would change the game of how they would get paid. But anyway, they come back with a record deal from Atlantic Records. I believe it was for $200,000, which again, a lot of money in those days. And I think it was for the first 4 or 5 albums the deal was supposed to be, or something like that. And the other thing about it was they wrote it into their contract. The band has complete creative control over their content, over the album covers, over the artwork, over everything. And it's hard to get that today, much less in a time where like the record industry completely dominated the artists. Somehow they were able to walk into Atlantic Records and come out with like the freaking brass ring. They got it all. Yeah. They got the money, they got the record deal, but they got the ability to tell the record company to go fuck themselves when they didn't like what the record company wanted them to do. And
is that all thanks to Jimmy's astuteness, or?
Yeah, and Peter Grant's astuteness as well, because they talked about it before they went in and said, well, this is what we want. And if we don't get it, we'll get it from CBS or we'll get it from somebody else. If you want to be part of this thing. And Ahmet Ertegun, who was, the genius of Atlantic Records, he knew what he was going to get from Jimmy Page. He knew he was going to get quality from Jimmy Page. So he was not, I think in retrospect, he would have liked to have retained more control than he did, but he was willing to bet on Jimmy Page's genius. Yeah. And, it was a really good bet. And despite the fact that he gave them the creative control, they made zillions of dollars for Atlantic Record, obviously. And so they come back and they have the record deal, and they start having to they actually had to go out and start playing a few contractually obligated dates that the Yardbirds still had. They had made dates and had to cancel. So there was a handful of dates that Led Zeppelin went out and played as the new Yardbirds.
And it was in Scandinavia.
Yeah, it was in Scandinavia.
I think their very first show was in Sweden or Norway, I think.
Denmark, I think.
Denmark. Pretty close.
Right. And the story there was that the Countess von Zeppelin of Denmark heard the band's name and freaked out and said, you can't use my family name, blah, 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 blah. And they said, what are you talking about? We can do whatever we want. But this was sort of around the time they had stopped playing as the new Yardbirds. But by the time they're on that Danish TV show, which we have some clips from, they're already Led Zeppelin.